Welcome to Newshour. With relations between the US and Europe in crisis, French President Emmanuel Macron walked a diplomatic tightrope in the White House yesterday, fluctuating between flattery and fact-checking. Well, Monsieur Macron conceded that President Trump was right to re-engage with President Putin, whilst at the same time correcting the US president on details of Ukraine funding. Now, with UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer flying into Washington on Thursday, how far will these efforts by European politicians to ameliorate the alliance across the Atlantic go? Well, let's go to Paris first tonight and get the latest from Ross Cullen.
Well, Guy, this was a meeting between two powerful men who have a warm relationship, and certainly there was lots of vigorous handshaking and backslapping, both leaders addressing each other by their first names, Dear Emmanuel and Dear Donald. And in fact, before we come on to Ukraine and Russia, Guy, it's worth mentioning that Donald Trump said that he felt Emmanuel Macron hadn't got enough credit for seeing through the 5-year reconstruction project of Notre Dame. And here in Paris in December, Donald Trump was one of the key invitees, the guests of honour at the reopening of the cathedral alongside Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, Donald Trump was also here during his first term in office and Emmanuel Macron's first term in office. He was invited to Bastille Day, the French National Day, and he was overawed by the display of French military hardware and patriotic pageantry, so certainly a warm relationship. And Emmanuel Macron also believes that he has the diplomatic nous to be able to speak to leaders from across the political spectrum, and he said that there was a possibility that the Ukraine war could be brought to an end in a matter of weeks. He praised the role of the United States for starting the work towards peace negotiations. He praised the United States and Donald Trump for being able to re-engage with Russia and Vladimir Putin, although the French leader did say that there was no doubt that France believed that Ukraine had been invaded by Russia, that Moscow was the aggressor, and that Russia had violated previous peace agreements. They also spoke about the possible deployment of French forces as part of a wider reassurance peacekeeping force after the end of the conflict. And Donald Trump said that he believes that Vladimir Putin would accept European peacekeepers on Ukrainian soil after the end of the war, which would be a major U-turn by Moscow. There was one tense moment when Emmanuel Macron interrupted Donald Trump, corrected Donald Trump after he had misrepresented how Europe's packages of aid to Ukraine are composed, mixes of loans and grants and other guarantees. And Emmanuel Macron suggested that one way the United States, Europe and other allies of Ukraine could recoup the money they had invested in Kiev would be by unfreezing the hundreds of billions of dollars of Russian assets that are currently frozen. So there was a lot to discuss and also a lot to debrief, and there will be an official debrief by the French President Emmanuel Macron to other EU leaders by video conference on Wednesday. Ross Cullen, A News in Paris.
The UK Prime Minister has announced today that the UK will raise defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2027. That's an increase of around £6 billion. Now, this comes as he prepares to follow the French President and join President Trump in Washington on Thursday. A News's Ollie Barrett reports now from outside number 10 Downing Street in London.
Well, Guy, London will be hoping to glean as much information as possible from Paris over the next couple of days before Keir Starmer heads to Washington, so that Downing Street can be as informed as possible about some of the discussions that took place, particularly in private, between Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron, working out whether there are areas in which Donald Trump seemed open to some of the arguments that Europeans are making, and potentially areas in which Emmanuel Macron potentially was reporting back some difficult parts of conversations. Now, Ross was talking about the body language between Emmanuel Macron and Donald Trump. I'm not sure that Keir Starmer is able to or wants to necessarily replicate all of that bonhomie and the knee holding and the long handshakes. That's not necessarily his style, but he has said before that in previous conversations and meetings with Donald Trump, those discussions have been warm and constructive, and certainly Donald Trump himself recently has said said that he likes Keir Starmer very much. So the UK Prime Minister will be hoping for positive engagement in Washington, but also well aware of the potential pitfalls. Keir Starmer's been stressing that when it comes to a Ukraine peace arrangement of some sort, he believes there has to be a so-called US backstop involved as part of that. He'll be absolutely making that case to Donald Trump. What Donald Trump might want to hear from Keir Starmer might revolve around UK defence spending, for example. How many troops might the UK be prepared to put on the ground in Ukraine in the event of some kind of peace agreement? So, as I say, Keir Starmer will be looking forward to the visit to Washington. He will know that there is an opportunity to make some of the arguments that European nations believe need to be made to Donald Trump around Ukraine and around Russia and the approach to both countries ahead of negotiations and peace talks. But he will also know of the dangers of the unpredictable US president in Donald Trump, and he will be hoping to avoid some kind of public disagreement while he's in Washington. Ollie Barrett in London for A News.
So how are these interventions by European leaders being seen stateside? Well, let's go to Washington now and speak to our very own Ube Shahbanda. Ube, always great to speak to you. Let's start with President Macron's visit then. A tricky tightrope for France's leader to walk. What's been the perception of that visit in Washington?
Well, the stakes were high, but it was all a laughter and a feeling of camaraderie in the Oval Office between Presidents Macron and Trump as the two world leaders met on Monday on the anniversary of the beginning of the war in Ukraine. You know, Macron really stressed that the war in Ukraine is a matter of European security, that the combat, the killings that are happening in Ukraine are only a little over 1,000 kilometers away from France, while of course the United States enjoys, as President Trump reminds us on a regular basis, the protection of two oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic. So it was very notable to hear in the joint press conference, President Trump saying that he was reassured that he heard from President Macron that Europe do more when it comes to European defense. That they must take a leadership role, that it cannot only be American troops, American soldiers that are stationed in Europe that take the primary role of defending the continent. And that was clearly Macron understanding who he was meeting with. Of course, he's met with President Trump before, but the message from President Trump following his phone call with President Putin of Russia, and of course following J.D. Vance, the vice president, the speech that he gave at the Munich Security Conference, that signal seems to have been heard loud and clear by Western European leaders that Washington wants more of a burden sharing by major Western militaries like France and the UK. We heard from President Trump at that joint press conference that the American taxpayer has paid a colossal amount of money of sending ammunition, weapons, and direct financial aid to prop up Ukraine in its war against the Russian invasion. And he wants to see the Europeans doing more. And Macron struck, seems, the right tone, and that President Trump wanted to hear. So it seems here that the president seems to have a fire under the feet of Western European leaders to get them to come together and put together a plan. Macron said that he believes a turning point had been reached, that it seemed that the French leader was confident that he is bridging the divide between President Zelensky of Ukraine and President Trump, particularly when it comes to that critical rare earth metal mining deal that the Americans want Ukraine to sign. So Macron said that he believed progress has been made on that issue. And of course, when it comes to the security force in Ukraine, that perhaps is the most impactful proposal here when it comes to the American peace negotiations on Ukraine, from that they, alongside the United Kingdom, plan on deploying a force perhaps around 30,000 soldiers that Macron referred to as a reassurance force in Ukraine. But big questions remain, though. What is this, a peacekeeping force? Will they have a NATO mandate? Does that include Article 5, which means if if the military forces of one NATO ally are attacked, that it's an attack against all of NATO. That remains unclear. But certainly here, Macron wanting to be the first European leader that makes the visit to Washington, D.C. And that is why we are seeing Starmer making this announcement that he is increasing a significant increase of the UK percentage of this GDP that will go towards defense. That seems calibrated alongside the European defense spending reassurances that Macron also gave to President Trump on his visit on Monday. So on Thursday, we can expect Keir Starmer to really follow through a coordinated message with Macron to reassure the American president that the United Kingdom and that other European military forces are going to spend their fair share on the defense of Europe, and that they will support the peace negotiations that that President Trump has launched with the Russians and Ukraine. And of course, the UK being a major backer of Ukraine, just as we heard with President Macron of France, wants to ensure that any deal that is finalized is a lasting and sustainable one and does not lead to what Macron called the surrender of Ukraine.
Ube, let's look a bit more at the UK now. Sir Keir Starmer, UK Prime Minister, he's not, to be frank, doing very well in the polls back at home. There doesn't seem to be the potential for strong personal chemistry between him and President Trump. Important meeting on Thursday, but it's not going to be the easiest visit, is it, for a British Prime Minister to Washington?
No, it is not, and that is perhaps why we've seen the Prime Minister make this announcement of an increase from 2.3% of the GDP to around 2.7%, and perhaps even higher down the line, that will be spent on defense. That is music to President Donald Trump's ears, and that's exactly what President Trump wants to hear. Look, President Trump, since his first term, has really been harking on the point that NATO member states need to spend not only 2% as a baseline of their GDP, but even more. Poland just recently announced that they are spending upwards of 5%, or their intent is to spend upwards of 5% of their GDP on defense. Of course, this is exactly what President Trump wants to hear. The big question is that will this increase of the percentage of the GDP when it comes to defense, will this translate to a larger arms, particularly when it comes to ground forces? Now, the United Kingdom has a large navy that's much larger than France's, but they still have the number of brigades, of combat brigades in Britain's army has significantly shrunk over the past decade. And we heard from Ukraine's Zelensky himself saying that the Russian armed forces have more brigades than Ukraine and all the European NATO member states combined. So when we hear of discussions by Great Britain and by France when it comes to European defense, will it actually translate into an actual tangible increase of their armed forces, particularly when it comes to ground forces? So I think it will be a difficult discussion, but I think Keir Starmer will take a great deal of lessons from Macron's meetings with President Trump. Look, Macron himself in the past years has had both a positive and negative relationship with President Trump. It goes up and down, but it seems that his visit on Monday was successful, and that President Trump, from the press conference, praised Macron, saying that he believed that Macron is going to work with the U.S. to get, as President Trump said, a deal done when it comes to Ukraine. So a blueprint, perhaps, for the British Prime Minister as he arrives to Washington on Thursday.
Okay, Ube, let's talk a little bit about the likelihood and the timeline for, as you say, that deal to get done. What is the real outcome here from these important meetings in terms of the Ukraine peace deal? Have the European leaders actually influenced Donald Trump in any way, perhaps diluting his perceived support of President Putin?
Well, there was a perception following President Trump's phone calls with President Putin, and of course the Riyadh negotiations, the first round, where it was just the Americans sitting down with the Russians. There's no European representative, so there was no Ukrainian representative. So there was a perception in Paris and London that this was a moment of, if not crisis, but a moment when they must take action. Of course, there was an emergency summit in Paris that took place immediately following the American-Russian negotiations in Riyadh. And in terms of action items, we saw President Macron scrambling to try to bridge that a gap that has been widening, at least on a personal basis, between President Trump and Zelensky. At the heart of that issue is the mineral rights agreement that the Americans want the Ukrainians to sign that would, in President Trump's words, recoup the billions of dollars that the U.S. has provided the Ukrainians. But it doesn't come with security guarantees. So it seems that Washington is leaving it to the European countries and the European armed forces, particularly with the UK and France being the largest and most hardened European armies, to provide those security guarantees for Ukraine. That being said, Macron really stopped short on Monday during that conference with President Trump in providing perhaps ironclad security guarantees for Ukraine, saying that that France, alongside Great Britain, want to deploy a reassurance force that would not be deployed on the front line or close to the areas that Russia has annexed. And certainly, President Trump has said that no American troops will be deployed in Ukraine following any peace deal once and if it is signed. But clearly here, the Trump administration is moving on a fast timescale and on a rapid timescale. And that has served as a function to both Macron and to Keir Starmer to try to catch up, to essentially try to, as much as possible, ensure that any deal with Ukraine that the Americans are negotiating also matches the security of London and Paris. So the big question is that can the United Kingdom and France come together and provide those security assurances to Ukraine, while at the same time reassuring President Trump that they will follow through on their promises to spend more on European defense. And I think that is something that Keir Starmer is going to have to convince President Trump. Of course, there is a special relationship between the U.S. and the United Kingdom. There is, of course, longstanding diplomatic relations between America and France. France helped, as President Trump mentioned in his speech, France played a critical role in the American Revolution in helping the American Revolutionary Forces become an independent country following the Revolutionary War against the British Empire. And of course, the U.S. and the United Kingdom have bled together in 2 world wars, and there's a number of defense and intelligence cooperation agreements between London and Washington. So that relationship, regardless of who's in power, is going to remain. President Trump perhaps will want the United Kingdom to spend above 2.7%, given the precedent that has been set by Poland, who of course is in Eastern Europe, not too far from Russia and the Russian military enclave of Kaliningrad. So perhaps a new bar will be set when it comes to defense spending. But when it comes to President Trump, he wants to see Europeans spending more so that the American taxpayer spends less when it comes to defense and conflict on the European continent.
Very interesting indeed. Thanks, as always, for your insight, Ube. Ube Sharbanda there for us in Washington, D.C. Well, that is all we have time for on this edition of Newshour. Please do stay with A News for more news and analysis. And from all of us here in Baku, thank you for watching.